empty spots over here too, so I want to grab those. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. This is a very special evening for Indivisible Huron Valley, and one we've been looking forward to for a long time. My name is Sherry Masson, and I'm part of the leadership team of Indivisible Huron Valley, along with Liz Estes and Sarah Moore, who you'll meet later. And, well, thanks. We appreciate that. I must say, your faces look a lot happier this month than they did last month. So, for those of you that have not attended one of our Indivisible meetings before, welcome. We are a local group of citizens who meet the second Wednesday of the month at the Milford Senior Center from 7 to 8:30. So please feel free to join us. If you haven't done so, you can sign up to receive our newsletter or just visit us on indivisiblehv.com. Our mission is to promote the principles and the institutions of democracy for all people. We believe in taking actions that are driven by our values, and one of our core values is education. We first educate ourselves so that we can share what we've learned in an intelligent way with our community and our families. And tonight is no exception. Our members have been alarmed by the spread of disinformation and asked that we have a speaker on the topic. And when our program team met at the beginning of the year, Dawn Collins said, "Let's think big. Let's see if we can get Barbara McQuade." And here we are. Thank you, Dawn, for your vision. We are honored and delighted that you were able to make these arrangements for this very special guest. There are a few directions I need to give before we hear from our special guest. If you have prepaid for Barbara's book, Attack from Within, and haven't picked it up yet, you can do so back in the corner and immediately after the program. Barbara has agreed to autograph books at that time, so please clearly print your name on a little Post-it note so that'll save time. And we thank you in advance for keeping that line moving so everybody can get a chance to get their book signed. And we want to give a special thank you to Two Dandelions Bookshop in Brighton for coming tonight and offering this service. Yes, we want to support small bookstores whenever we can. So our schedule will go like this. We're going to listen to the conversation between Barbara and Dawn about her book, and then we hopefully will have some time for a few questions. And so if you have any questions that you write on the card, please just raise your hand and Holly will come and get it from you and bring it up to me. Around 8 o'clock, Liz and Sarah are going to come up and they're going to kick off the book signing portion of the evening by raffling off 3 books of the books that Indivisible Huron Valley has purchased. So hang on to your raffle ticket. During that time, we invite you to mingle, to have conversations about what you've heard tonight. We also, on the other table, we have voting information. We have information on Project 2025, compliments of Distill Social, and we also have some Indivisible information you're welcome to take. And you're going to see Holly and a couple of our volunteers going around and with a sign-up sheet, because we have elections coming up. And we could always use help, especially on our local elections. So check the box on something you feel you can do, and we may give you a call and have you join us in getting involved in the elections. And at this time, I'm going to pass the mic to Dawn.
Thank you, and thank you to Barbara for joining us this evening. It is truly my pleasure to welcome her on behalf of Indivisible Huron Valley to discuss her book, Attack from Within, How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. In 2010, President Obama appointed Barb as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, where she served until 2017 as the first woman in that role. She's currently a professor from practice at the University of Michigan, where she's teaching courses in criminal law, criminal procedure, national security, and data privacy. You may have seen her as the legal analyst for NBC News and MSNBC, or heard her as a co-host on the podcast Sisters-in-Law. With all of this background, Barbara authored Attack from Within, which was published just an uneventful 6 months ago. So, no small questions. What are we dealing with, and how do we recognize and counteract all of the disinformation that we're seeing? And what on earth prompted you to write this book?
Well, thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Dawn. First, let me say how delighted I am to be here. It's not often that you get to see such community democracy in action, and it really warms my heart to see how many people are here just because they want to focus on unity, on democracy, on making our society better. And so I really appreciate all of you just for being here tonight. Thank you. It also always makes me happy to see Detroit Tigers logos on hats and shirts. That makes me happy. Why did I decide to write this book? So I spent most of my career as a national security prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Detroit. And when I left that job, I started teaching at Michigan Law School, where I teach a course on national security. And the threats to our country have really evolved over time since the time I started working in this space. Originally, it was Al-Qaeda, and then it was ISIS, and then it was cyber attacks and hacks. And as I began teaching this class, this idea of disinformation and information warfare has been a growing threat and a growing component of my course since I started teaching it in 2017. And we learn in that course some of the tactics of disinformation. And we learn about how the goals are sometimes to simply stoke division in society to get us mad at each other. And so I thought that what I wanted to do was write a book that was accessible to everybody so that people could learn the tactics of disinformation and the motives and why it works and understand the harms so that we could build resilience as a society against it. And to have conversations like this about the importance of truth in a democracy. So I'm really delighted to be here tonight to talk with you more about it.
Well, to that end, what is disinformation? What is misinformation? And then what's propaganda?
Yeah, such good questions. So, I think different people define them in different ways. Propaganda really is just any sort of art of persuasion. In fact, it began not as a pejorative term, a negative term in any way, propaganda, but to propagate. And it was done to propagate the religious faiths, to go out and to try to persuade. But disinformation and misinformation use false claims. So disinformation, deliberate use of false information to manipulate people, to advance some sort of agenda, whether it's profit, like Fox News and the Dominion voting scandal, or it is a political cause, or it's an individual career. Disinformation is the deliberate use of false information to advance their agenda. Misinformation is kind of its unwitting cousin. When some of us read something, we believe it to be true, and then we pass it on to others, and thereby we become conduits, useful idiots to the person who wants to spread this word. We read it, we believe it, and we share it with others. I'll tell you about a time, I will confess to you, that I once, myself, even I, once fell for disinformation. I'm sure it's happened many times. But I'll talk later. I hope we'll get a chance to talk about some tips to avoid doing what I did. But a few years ago, I was reading online some message that said that Patrick Mahomes had issued a statement saying that he would refuse to play another down for the Kansas City Chiefs, right, where he is the star quarterback in the NFL, until they changed their name to something that was not offensive to Native Americans. And so I read that and thought, wow, that's big news, isn't it? Patrick Mahomes is going to give up his multi-million dollars to take a stand. Wow, that's amazing. So I retweet that and send that out. And later that day it occurred to me, I hadn't seen that story anywhere else. I talked to my husband, did you see that story about Patrick Mahomes? Like, now what story? Huh. So I went back and looked, and I thought, gee, it looked legit when I read it. And I looked back at my phone and I saw, well, it did come from ESPN. That's pretty legit source, right? But then I looked a little more carefully, and I saw it was not ESPN's flagship sports center, but something that looked a lot like it that said Sprott's Center. It was a fake. It was a fake, and I didn't see it coming, and so I took it down. But it's a great example of how we can become carriers of misinformation because we read something, we believe it to be true. It's usually something that evokes an emotional response. Oftentimes it is something that will help stoke the culture wars. People have strong views on one side or another about DEI and wokeness and tradition and all kinds of things. And so I played right into their hands and posted it. So to me, that's misinformation when we believe something to be true and we spread it without realizing it.
So what are some of the other methods of promoting disinformation?
What are some of the other methods of promoting disinformation, especially with AI and the visual and audio things that people are doing?
Yeah, so it's very interesting because although the tactics of disinformation have really stayed the same over time, we now have very new ways of spreading it and really expanding the reach with social media and, as you say, artificial intelligence. And so, there have already been some things. So some of the goals are simply to suppress the vote from certain likely voters who might vote for my opponent. And so we saw, for example, utilizing artificial intelligence, you may have read about in the New Hampshire primary, a number of people received those recorded robocalls, that you get on election day, this is so-and-so, vote for me. It was the voice, it sounded like the voice of Joe Biden, but what he said was, I'm urging you to stay home this election. Don't waste your vote in the primary, save it for the general. I mean, that doesn't even make any sense, right? But he said, if you vote in the primary, you are playing right into the hands of Donald Trump. That's just what he wants you to do. Again, it makes no sense. But it was generated with artificial intelligence. You can find it on the internet. I've listened to it. It sounds really good, complete with malarkey and all kinds of other references. And this was believed to be a dry run for the fall. And you could imagine the kind of chaos that could occur on an election day. Now, imagine, it's election day and people are getting calls that say things like, this is your polling place and the power is out today. And so you should come cast your vote tomorrow. Right? Now, many people would say that's nonsense, I'm going anyway, but other people might say, oh, good to know, I'm going to stay home, and then they're going to show up the next day and waste their vote. So this idea of suppressing voter turnout is part of it that gets spread. And then another big part of it really is just to stoke division in society. This is something that we saw Russia do quite effectively in 2016. They formed a number of false personas online designed to look like ordinary Americans, and then they would say things that were designed to generate outrage by other people. So there were some that pretended to be heart of Texas, and they started pushing that Texas should secede from the Union. Right? So other people say that, and look at those ridiculous people. Or they posed as the United Muslims of America, the Tennessee GOP, Coal Miners for America, so groups on the left and the right. And then they would say the most ugly, vile, racist, bigoted things, not to attract members of their own group, but so that people in other groups would say, look at how awful those people are. And so it stoked anger, and people were feeling angry with the other person. and lately the most recent incident that I've seen is there is an ad going around. Don't know who made it, but Elon Musk did tweet it or post it on X, and it's this artificial intelligence created campaign ad for Kamala Harris. It takes her real campaign ad, where I think the theme of it is freedom. It shows her saying a bunch of things, but it changes her voice to say things like, "I'm the DEI pick. I got picked because I'm woke and Joe Biden was senile." And then she laughs a few times throughout it. She's been being mocked for her laugh. And she says all kinds of outrageous things about why she's running and what she'll do that's, designed to scare people. Now, some people will look at it and know right away it's fake, but I'm sure it looks great. Like, the quality of it is amazing. I don't know if people have seen it. And so you see this and you believe it to be true. And so it's very off-putting, I think, for anybody who is perhaps not inclined to vote for her. To look at, if you're a moderate voter, to look at this thing, I think it would be very off-putting to a lot of people. So, so those are some of the tactics that are out there, but they really are designed to push our buttons in the fault lines of society: race, immigration, abortion, LGBTQ community issues, whatever those hot button issues are, just stoking outrage to get us mad at each other. And that's a big part of what we're seeing. And outrage sells. I mean, you look at, when I was working in the U.S. Attorney's Office, who really got the results? Jeffrey Feiger. Remember Jeffrey Feiger? He's a great lawyer, but you know why? He generates outrage. He gets the jury so outraged. This is the worst thing I've ever seen. And the jury gets outraged, and they award these multi-million-dollar verdicts because he's ginning up outrage. It's a tactic, and you see it in some of the shock radio shows, some of the podcasts. Steve Bannon's War Room. They're constantly just go on and listen to it for just about 5 minutes, and it's horrifying, but it is designed to generate outrage, and so that is a tactic that. And so when you are sort of primed for that, people are inclined to believe what they want to believe, and we can talk perhaps about some of those cognitive features that cause us to believe what we want to believe.
Let's do that, but I'm also curious, is the disinformation coming from outside state actors, or is it coming more from the two parties?
Yeah, both. So, in 2016, one of the things I assigned to my law students is the Mueller report. Not so much for what he did or did not find about Donald Trump. That is sort of now a moot point in light of the Supreme Court's recent decision. But for what it described about the tactics of Russia, about how they were trying to stoke division in society and influence the outcome with these influence campaigns on social media. But it was so successful that we have now seen American political operatives replicate those tricks because it works. It works. And so, this idea of stoking division in society. There are a number of tactics that I describe in the book that have been used throughout history, used by Hitler, used by Mussolini, and other strongmen throughout history. And there are a number of them. And one is this idea of declinism, to suggest that American society, or whatever, German society is going downhill. Everything is terrible. Our future is very bleak. The whole world is laughing at us. It is not as good as it used to be. Cities in ruin, American carnage. This is what Hitler talked about to gain power in Germany, that after World War I, the economy was not so good, and everything's awful, 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 because extreme times permit extreme measures. And so Hitler ultimately, suspended the Constitution. It also provides an opportunity to drive wedges in society, right? If everything is bad, 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 then somebody must be to blame for this, right? And so let's pick out some scapegoats. In Germany, it was the Jewish people. Today, depending on who it is, it might be immigrants, right? And to other them, they are animals and vermin, we hear. Or it might be the LGBTQ community. Governor DeSantis in Florida has made that a favorite target. that they are grooming your children for pedophilia. And so these others can be, you know, this enemy that is the reason our economy is so poor is because these other people are taking your jobs, or they're controlling the levers of the economy. You know, look over here, not over there, and let's not talk about the fact that CEO salaries are at an all-time high. We've sent a lot of jobs offshore. The income disparity is greater than it's ever been. Let's not talk about that. Let's blame immigrants, or the LGBTQ community, or minority groups, or the elites. That's another one, because the elites are a Rorschach test, right? They can be anyone you don't like. The elites are up to their controlling all of this. So all of those tactics are things that we are seeing today. I think by some measure, both parties engage in it. I think at this moment in history, we are seeing the far right faction of the Republican Party traffic in it more than any other. But, you know, just as people who were defending the mental acuity of Joe Biden, I think that is a form of disinformation. And so it is not, there's no party that is pure of it.
What makes us inclined to believe some of those things? And I'm thinking of the shot of Kamala Harris in the jet here in Detroit.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, there was no crowd, there was nobody there. But people are willing to take the word of a mechanic without a name rather than all of the other information. What is it about us that...
Yeah, so there are a number, I've got a chapter in the book, because this I find fascinating, and this was the area I knew the least about and spent a lot of time researching. There are a number of things. Fear is certainly one, right? We don't want to lose our place in society. We're worried about our financial well-being. We're worried about our jobs. We're worried about our children. And so anything that seems to be a threat to that is certainly something that is going to resonate. Conspiracy theories. We love a good conspiracy theory. It turns out we're actually wired to believe in conspiracy theories. You know, in the earliest of times, when someone saw dark clouds gathering in the sky, they learned that means a storm's coming and I better go inside, right? We don't have to reinvent the wheel in our mind every time it happens. And so it makes us, however, susceptible to believing there must be a pattern and a reason all of these things are happening. Like, you know, those things didn't all come together just by accident, Dawn. You know, it wasn't. That's what they want you to think. Yeah. So we're you know, inclined to believe in conspiracy theories. You know, there's still people trying to figure out who shot JFK from the grassy knoll, right?
Still people who think that he's not dead.
Yeah, the elites want you to believe that. They want you to think. But you know, one of the things they talk about in the book is not only do we fall for some of these things, but some of us are willing to go along with the con. And that's because, in part, we have confirmation bias, and so we want to see, you know, if the candidate is someone we really like, then we want to believe in what they tell us. If it's someone we don't like, then we might tend to disagree with everything they have to say. So do you ever go see a stand-up comedian? If it's like someone that you like and you think is good, people start laughing before they even say a word, right? Because they know he's going to be so funny. That is like that confirmation bias at work. But I think one of the things, and it's one of the reasons that it's so good to have a group like yours, Indivisible, is I think that in our highly hyper-partisan times, people don't care about the truth. I think that people who say, yeah, Kamala Harris didn't have a big crowd some people will believe that, right? Trump posted on Truth Social, and people will look at that and they'll believe it. Others will read it and not really care. But what they want to do is signal to others that they are part of the tribe. We are tribe signaling. In the same way, something else that's going on right now, you know, there's been this false claim about J.D. Vance and a couch that has made the rounds. Zero factual basis in that. Someone falsely claimed that it was written about in Hillbilly Elegy. Not true, not one iota of it true. And yet, we see Tim Walz cracking jokes about it, right, and people laughing. Do they believe it to be true? Probably not. But it is that idea that we don't really care, because what we really want to do is show that we're part of the team. Yeah, way to go. I do give a lot of credit to Kamala Harris these days, because crowds are starting to chant lock him up.
Right.
And again, it's all part of the fun and the cheer, and they're laughing as they do it because it's part of being part of the tribe. And she has shut that down and said, look, we're a country of the rule of law and due process, and so we can't just lock people up because we don't like them.
So how does disinformation, how is that weakening our gatekeepers, our boundaries, our laws?
Yeah, I think it's having a lot of problematic effects. First, just on democracy in general. One of the goals of foreign influence has been to undermine democracy and people's confidence that democracy works as a form of government. And so when you hear people saying, will you agree to abide by the outcome of the election? And they say, well, only if it's not rigged, only I'll have to wait and see. That really undermines public confidence in elections. And keep in mind, this is based on zero evidence of actual election fraud in 2020. You all saw it unfold, what happened in 2020. Something like 60 lawsuits across the country, all failed. There were people storming the TCF Center in Detroit, falsely claiming that people were bringing, extra ballots. I actually talked to someone who was part of the media crew who was bringing a wagon filled with his camera gear that was falsely alleged to be, here are the ballots they're rolling in. He's like, that's my camera. I know that's not true. But in response to those false claims, completely baseless, something like 7 states have changed their election laws to make it more difficult to vote this time around because of all the fraud. Georgia, where, of course, Donald Trump worked hard to try to get the state to overturn Joe Biden's victory there, they had Republican leaders there who stood tall. Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, and their governor, Brian Kemp, who said, our election has been audited, it was fair, it was accurate, it was free, it was open, you can count on it. And yet, Governor Kemp signed into law one of the most restrictive new voting laws, which, if there is no fraud, you have to ask yourself, then why does it exist? And, I submit that it is to suppress the votes of people who might be living at the margins, for whom it might be difficult to get a voter ID, for whom it might be difficult to actually show up at the polls on election day, might not have the time to wait in a long line. And so we are seeing this detrimental effect on democracy. I also think it is having a detrimental effect on public safety and the rule of law. Just yesterday, Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson said that her home had been swatted twice. She previously, in 2020, after certifying the election, had armed protesters come to her home. And what is her sin? Administering our elections and doing her best to get out there and try to let people know what we need to do to vote. We have seen political violence in our country. The January 6th attack, trying to prevent the certification and peaceful transfer of presidential power, incredibly alarming. The assassination attempt against President Trump. After that episode, depending on your perspective, there were people who traffic in disinformation who said either that it was Joe Biden seeking to take out his rival, or that it was a false flag operation cooked up by Trump to look heroic, when he stood up and raised his fist and all of that. But I do believe it is leading to all of the threats that we see against school officials, health officials, election officials, and people claiming they have a First Amendment right to say things, whatever they want, which includes threats and harassment. And so, book bans and other kinds of things have really caused people, I think, to lose faith in the rule of law, to lose faith in our institutions like our courts. When you've got the president telling everybody that our courts are a laughingstock, that the FBI is corrupt, then people feel inclined to take the law into their own hands. As we saw, the guy who attacked Nancy Pelosi's husband with a hammer, or Kyle Rittenhouse on the streets of Kenosha, Wisconsin. I mean, the poor kid, he's 17, and he believes these claims that he's got to go back and take back the streets because there's no other way to do it, and finds himself in this awful situation where he ends up killing 2 people with his assault weapon. And so I think that this betrayal of truth, this choosing tribe over truth, is really causing some dangerous situations with our democracy, with our standing in the world, and with public safety.
So the First Amendment guarantees free speech, but free speech does have limits. Okay. What do you suggest is solution to start to put a stop to some of this?
Yeah, I think that there's no one solution. You can't just say, here's the one solution and it will solve everything, because I think it's a very complex problem. But I think there are things we can do on the demand side of disinformation and things we can do on the supply side of disinformation. Let's start with the supply side. So all of the stuff, the fake stuff that comes on social media, I think is a great place to start, and some things we can do. And you mentioned the First Amendment, because the first thing you hear from the big tech companies whenever there's any discussion about regulation is, oh, First Amendment, you want to censor me, this is all censorship. And the First Amendment is something that we cherish in America, and for good reason. It is what allows us to speak out against our government. And so it is not absolute, as you say, that there can be narrow restrictions as long as there's a compelling governmental interest to support it, like you can't communicate a threat to kill somebody, that's a crime. You can't commit perjury in a courtroom, that's a crime. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater or a crowded school auditorium. Because it wreaks havoc with public safety. The Supreme Court has said the Bill of Rights is not a suicide pact, right? So we do value free speech, but we have some limits on it. But what I'm suggesting for social media would not even go toward content, because I think it's complicated. It may be worth exploring, but I think the processes that social media companies use could be some areas where we could have some common sense regulation. For one, there was a whistleblower who was a former data scientist for Facebook who testified before Congress. Her name was Frances Haugens, and she said, it's not the content, it's the algorithms. And she explained how that all worked. And it was fascinating because what she told members of Congress is that Facebook, can calibrate the settings and tell your Facebook feed which messages to push to the top. It used to be that it was kind of like your family scrapbook, Aunt Millie and I went to Niagara Falls, and here are our pictures, and that's what showed up in your feed. But what they started doing instead to increase engagement, which meant the amount of time you spent online, which also meant the amount they could charge advertisers, the more engagement there was, the longer you were on, the more money they could make. And so they found that they started pushing news. It became a news feed as well. And when people were outraged, they stayed on the platform longer because they had to say, can you believe this? Or they had to send it to their friend, or they had to argue with them and say, you're wrong, wrong, wrong. And so as a result, and there's also that sick frowny face thing, if you hate something, it was calibrated to rise up and show you first the things that were most likely to generate outrage. And so they were manipulating people, stoking division for a profit. And so why can't we have regulations that prohibit that, or at least disclose it, so that if we're being manipulated, we know that. So I think that's one thing that we could do with social media. I think another is we could prevent them from scraping our private data the way they do and sell it to data brokers, who in turn sell it to political operatives and commercial enterprises. It's probably no surprise that I got that Patrick Mahomes tweet, because they're able, through my likes and my preferences and my posts and all the things all my activity online, to be able to know what my profile is and to micro-target us. Have you ever noticed when you're online, whether it's Google or social media, whatever it is you're shopping for, there it is. These days I get a lot of ads for Detroit Tigers caps. Why, yes, I would like to buy one of those. They know me so well, they know me better than I know myself. But as a result, they're able to target you with ads and other content that is likely to provoke you. There was an organization developed by Steve Bannon called Cambridge Analytica. You may have read about this group. 2016 election, they made this their mission. It was to figure out how to gather all that data about people so they could micro-target them, and they were building profiles on different voters. By working with Facebook, pretending they were collecting the data only for research purposes, they had one of these quizzes on Facebook. Take our 10-question quiz and find out what kind of personality you are. 87,000 people took the quiz, and when they did, it unleashed access to all of their data that Cambridge Analytica could take, and all of the data of all of their Facebook friends, for a total of 250 million people. So they built these dossiers on people, and they would know how to target them. It got exposed, it was dismantled, and it doesn't exist anymore. And Facebook says they have changed their settings, so that's no longer possible. But that's the kind of thing that we really just trust them to do. Regardless of how good or bad X or Facebook or LinkedIn or any of these companies are, we have to remember that the business of business is business, right? They're going to make money, and no harm to them. But to put in some guardrails to protect all of us from some of their less helpful ambitions might not be a bad idea.
Am I correct in my understanding that European laws for social media are significantly different than here in the US, and that it goes back to we were willing to allow our data to be mined so that we didn't have to pay for Facebook and okay.
Yeah, I always tell my kids, if you don't know what the product is you. Like, it's free! I signed up for it's free! I signed up for a free account, a free coupon, a free membership at Tropical Smoothie. No offense, Tropical Smoothie, you're delicious. They have your data, and they will use it and sell it and use it for other kinds of things. Yes, in Europe they have something called the General Data Privacy Regulation that is much more aggressive about protecting people's private data. In fact, it's because of those things that, if you notice that more and more you see things like accept cookies that you have to do, a lot of that is to comply with European laws, and also California has also created some data privacy rules, which is where many of these big tech companies are located. And so we're moving in that direction, but there's certainly more we can do. I just click it and don't read the policy anyway, right? Except, go on, give me my data.
So, there's so many thoughts that this happened when I was reading the book. You read something and then the thoughts just start swirling around in your head, trying to figure out which way to go. Is there social media or media outlets that you think are getting it right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I talked a little bit about solutions from the supply side. On the demand side, that's us and how we use social media or how we consume all media. I think there are a number of things that we can do, and there's some good sites that are fact-checking websites that we can use to help us verify claims. And some of these claims are deliberately murky. People will take a germ of truth and then twist it to suit their purpose. One of these is Hunter Biden's laptop. Like, what on earth happened to Hunter Biden's laptop? Oh my gosh, I don't know. Was it Russia? Was it planted? It was used at the trial against him. That sounds pretty real. Was it authenticated? And so if you want to know what's the real deal with Hunter Biden's laptop, there are some really good sites where you can go and look for things. So if you're not sure about a certain story and you've heard something, so there's one that's called Snopes.com. People may have heard that. Snopes.com is a good one. Something called PolitiFact.org, and there's factcheck.com. All very good in terms of checking facts. There's also something called Ground News that will tell you the bias left, right, center of whatever news outlet you're reading, which can be useful. And then there's another one that's fairly new called NewsGuard that gives sort of nutritional labels for different news outlets in terms of, accuracy, bias. They have a whole, the same way a nutrition label will have calories and carbs and all those kinds of things. It has a number of those. So I think that's a really useful thing. But I will also say that there are things we can do ourselves in terms of media literacy to be better consumers of media. And I think it would be great to have media literacy in our schools, and some schools are implementing that. I think it would be great to have media literacy for adults through civic organizations and libraries and groups like this. But I'll give you a few tips right now about things that you can do to protect yourself from falling for false claims. It's not, foolproof, but just some good common sense things that you can do. So, when you read an article somewhere, number one, assessing the credibility of the source. If it came, if I'm reading something online, it was posted by the Detroit News or the Detroit Free Press, I'll think that's probably reliable, right? Because they've got professional staff, they have professional reporters, journalists, editors who are putting that out there. And so I will read those facts, and I can, pretty much take that to the bank. I'll believe that is true. Less so when it is some individual with a pseudonym like Patriot Girl. Eagle Man. Well, Eagle Man says that the Trump assassination was all a setup. It's probably not the most credible claim. So who is putting this out there? Is it a journalist? Is it a scientist? Is it someone in their field who is knowledgeable about that thing? Is it a government official? Credibility of the source is important. If only I had taken my own advice when I looked at that Patrick Mahomes on ESPN Sprott Center, I would have noticed. And in fact, right now, a recent trend put out by Russia is fake news sites that look real. So I know there's such a thing as the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press, but what I might not know is the names of newspapers in other cities. So they've got one called the Chicago Chronicle, fake. DC Weekly, fake. The Miami Tribune, papers that don't exist, but they create like a nice masthead, and with artificial intelligence, it's actually fairly easy for them to create these things. So you read it, and you think, well, that's from a legitimate, news organization, that must be true. Not so. So if it's a news organization you've never heard of before, maybe, give it a quick search and see if that's a real thing before you bank on it. All right, so credible source, number one. Number two, good to look for a second source. Again, with my Patrick Mahomes thing, if only I had looked for a second source. Because if it's a big news story, all the news outlets are going to be reporting it. It won't be just Patriot Girl who knows about the scandal. Some other people probably know about that too. So before, you need to use critical thinking. You need to use some skepticism. And so if it seems something that's, wow, that seems a little bit out there, you're looking for a second source. Here's another one. And it's easy to be guilty of this in our very busy, fast-paced times. You have to read more than just the headline, right? Read the article. I have learned, Dawn, that the headline often bears very little resemblance to the article. Yeah, I once visited the Detroit Free Press, and somebody was taking me on a tour of the newsroom recently, and they showed me a big digital board they have where they rank the news stories and by the number of clicks. And the top of the board were all things like celebrity news, weather, pets, and way down at the bottom were things like city council, state budget, things that maybe you ought to be paying attention to. And so what they do is these headlines are often what's referred to as clickbait, because they want you to click on the headline, because if you click on the headline, it means you are going to see more ads, and ads is how they generate revenue. No, it's business, we're a capitalist society, I take no offense, but that headline is designed to be clickbait. So I saw one just the other day that said, Caitlin Clark, she's this basketball star who played at the University of Iowa, and now she's in the WNBA. It said, Caitlin inside the Caitlin Clark media meltdown. Oh, wow, she had a meltdown in front of the media. That's awful. I know she's been getting a lot of media attention, but she's usually so unflappable. That's awful. Well, I better click and read about that. That sounds juicy. Turns out it wasn't Caitlin Clark who had any sort of media meltdown. It was a reporter called her a profanity-laced name. That was the Caitlin Clark media meltdown. And so if all you had read was the headline, you would have been left with a very false impression. So those are just a few tips for helping yourself build some resilience against disinformation.
What concerns do you have for what is likely to happen after this election, regardless of who wins?
Yeah, such a good question. I don't know. You know, I've lost my confidence in my ability to prognosticate in politics in 2016. I was so startled by what happened. And then in 2020, we were all working from home in those days, right? Wait, was it 2020? Yeah, 2020. We were all working from home. I was working from home, and my husband came into the room and said, "Do you have any idea what's happening right now?" I said, "No, what do you mean?" He said, "There's people storming the Capitol." I'm like, "What?" And so we went into the living room and watched on television, just horrified to see that people had taken to armed violence against officers at the Capitol. So no, I don't. I worry about a number of things. One of the things I really worry about is that disruption could occur this time at polling places. I really worry about that. And so to the extent you are inclined and interested in getting involved, I think being a volunteer poll worker would be a great thing because there's, there's safety in numbers. And so if there are a lot of, polling places are not understaffed, I think that could help a lot. But, you could imagine there are positions in both parties where you can be a challenger and you can challenge people's eligibility to vote. And I worry that, not that people will be prevented from voting, but it will just slow things down and disrupt things. And the lines will get long and people will be turned away or they'll just, give up and go home because of that disruption. I hope it's not the case, but I do worry about that a little bit, that just imagine, a power outage at a polling place. Things like that could cause problems. I worry about that. We're all going to be watching on January 6th, although, sometimes people criticize Congress that they don't get anything done these days, but they did pass a really important reform about the Electoral Count Act that makes it clear that the Vice President's role really is just to count the votes and that he can't change the outcome, and also that to challenge the outcome, it requires 1/5 of the total members of Congress. It used to be just one member of Congress could stop everything and challenge, and now it requires 1/5 of the body. So it would require, some, I think, good faith, legitimate claim before that can happen. So some small reasons for optimism, but I remain very concerned about what could happen.
So that's a point of optimism. What does keep you optimistic? Because I have a feeling you're probably privy to way more information than most of us.
I'll tell you one thing that really does make me optimistic is meeting people like all of you in this room. I've had a chance to do a bunch of book talks all across the country, which is great, by the way. It's the best part of writing a book. If you have any ideas for a book, do it and then go travel because it's really fun. But it has been so heartening to meet people like you who are really concerned, interested, engaged, eager for information, and there are a lot of you out there. It's not just, this group. Indivisible is a national organization, so there are groups like this meeting all over the country. But there are other groups as well, and there are a lot of smart people who care about our democracy. So I think 2016 was a painful wake-up call for a lot of people, 2020 again, but if there has been a silver lining of this era of disinformation, I think it has been that people realize that democracy is not something we can take for granted. We really need to be engaged and participating if we're going to preserve it.
Is there a question that you wish you would have been asked tonight?
No, you've covered it all, but I'd love to hear any question that anybody has out there. I know you've been collecting cards and have questions, so I would love to answer audience questions. Thank you, Dawn. Great job.
Okay. I do have a few questions here, and some of them were already answered, so I took those out of the pile, so you probably know who you are. And here's one more.
Oh boy, here they come.
Okay, no worries.
I'll try to keep my answers fast.
You gave the example of the AI and coming up with these horrible things, like the robocall that came out. Are there, is there possible, can there be laws against that would make that illegal? Flat out lies in advertising? What could be done about that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So I think there could be, but there currently are not. In Michigan, we have recently passed a couple of laws that require labeling of AI-generated political ads, which is good. So, hey, you want to be creative and here's your thing, that's fine, but a label that says this was created with artificial intelligence so that we can assess the weight of that. I think that's a great one. Another new law we have in Michigan is it is now illegal to create, one of the other trends that's going on in schools especially is deep fake nudes of real students. So say there's a teenage girl may have posted pictures of herself on social media, Instagram, playing soccer. And people will take her face and put it on, the body of some porn site, which is awful and humiliating and bullying for teens. And Michigan just passed a law that says it is illegal to create a pornographic image of a real person without their permission. So there are some things that are going on, but there's more that can be done. And so I think, I'm always a fan of more information as a way to defeat bad information. And so I think labeling is really a great way for us to be aware that, this content may have been generated and it might not be real. So, helping us to process what it is we're seeing.
What is the status of the documents case? The documents found at Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah.
Fill us in.
So you may recall that it's all like a streaming series, isn't it? It's like the Trump Show season 8. When we last met, in last week's episode, so this of course is the indictment in which Donald Trump has been charged with unlawfully retaining, after leaving office, sensitive national security documents. It's actually not classified, although some of them are, but that's not the crime. It's that they pertain to national defense secrets and that he unlawfully retained them once his office expired and he no longer had authority to do that, and obstructing the investigation. The judge presiding over the case dismissed the case in its entirety, but not on the merits, on the grounds that the special counsel, Jack Smith, who was appointed by the Department of Justice, the regulations are unconstitutional. It's a little bit of a surprise only because we've had a number of special counsels under these regulations, from Robert Mueller to Robert Hur and David Weiss and others. But she found that it is an unauthorized office under some language of the Constitution, which talks about superior officers and inferior officers, and if you're a superior officer, you have to be confirmed by the Senate, and since he wasn't, it's illegal. And so that decision is being appealed, and the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals will decide it. It may go to the Supreme Court, but we'll get an answer. But that doesn't mean the case is over. It does mean the case is delayed. They'll wait for the final decision, whether that comes from the Circuit Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court. Once that decision is final, the case can be refiled by the Department of Justice. The reason they appoint a special counsel is to avoid arguments that there is some bias because the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, works for the current president, Joe Biden. At the time, he was running against Donald Trump, and to avoid an appearance of partiality, he appointed Jack Smith, the senior prosecutor, to handle the case. But if it becomes the case that these regulations are truly unconstitutional, then I think the Justice Department will refile the case and just reassign it to the normal course of DOJ lawyers. So I think eventually that case will come to pass, unless, of course, if Donald Trump is elected, I think, as the chief executive and the boss of DOJ, the Department of Justice, he could simply order his Attorney General to dismiss the case. I think the Attorney General can and would do that, and to the extent that there was a time when that would have been considered obstruction of justice, the Supreme Court has said that that is not a crime for which a president can be charged.
Oh, that's so depressing.
Well, there's one way to prevent that scenario from taking place.
That's right. That's right.
Knock on some doors, make some phone calls, write some postcards.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay. I'm not sure about this, but I'll give it a shot. I'm very concerned with billionaire Elon Musk contributing his millions to the Trump campaign and controlling and X. Who wrote this?
That's good enough, I'm good. A few bars.
Okay, I was going to ask.
We can talk about it.
Okay, I believe in anyway.
Yeah, so, Elon Musk, love him or hate him, genius or, evil genius, whatever you think of him, the idea that an individual can do what he did, which is to pledge $45 million a month to the Trump campaign, is the antithesis of democracy. I mean, he's essentially buying a president. And who can keep up with that? And one of the reasons we have this situation in our country is because of the Supreme Court case called Citizens United, which you may remember from 2010. There are still limits on how much money an individual can give to a presidential candidate. I think it's something like $3,400, and you can give it to them both in the primary and the general, so you can give them a total of $6,800, and that's the limit. But these political action committees can give without limit as long as they don't coordinate with the campaign. That means you can see these ads like Kamala Harris is the devil. These the grainy, nasty, or issue ads. Immigrants are taking over our country. Whatever it is, there's no limit on the amount they can spend on that, and the political action committees are not required to disclose their donors. And so there are all kinds of groups out there with wonderful sounding names that sound like grassroots organizations, the Red, White, and Blue Grandmothers of America. And in fact, it might be one person or one industry, like we really care about our coal factory, and so we're going to call ourselves Red, White, and Blue Grandmothers of America, and we're going to pump a lot of money into issue ads that support the candidate that are in our best financial interest. So what can we do about it? I don't think Citizens United is going to be overturned anytime soon with the current makeup of the court, but we could do some other things like require transparency in who these donors are. So, Elon Musk goes out there and tells you what he's doing, but at least with some of these political action committees, if we knew who they were, it would help us to see through when it's paid for by Red, White, and Blue Grandmothers of America. We know, well, that's really big tobacco, that's the coal industry, that's the gun industry. And so we can take with a grain of salt what they're selling us.
This is probably our last question. He or she who wrote this mentioned that Al Franken wrote a book called Lies and the Lying Liars That Tell Them. And his or her question is, can you talk about the word choices that we're using or that people are using, and should we use plain language to get our point across?
Yeah, so lies is a great word. It's simple, it's blunt, and people know what it means. I think until recently, the mainstream media was very reluctant to use the word lie when it came to presidential candidates. And, I don't know why that is, because I think it suggests that there is a sort of moral relativism, that there really is no such thing as truth, and you can't really call a liar. And I think if someone just flat out lies, like, Kamala Harris did not have a crowded Detroit Metro Airport. That's just a lie, right? We saw the pictures, we know. I have friends who were there. That's just a lie, and we should say so. I actually use the word disinformation because it encompasses, in my view, more than lies, and it comes from the intelligence community. It is about some of the tradecraft that is used not just to lie, but to elicit an emotional response and nudge you to take certain action, to speak out, to vote, to say nasty things. All of that is, programmed to push your buttons. The same way I got the Patrick Mahomes thing in an effort to get a rise out of me. Disinformation is more than just a lie. It is an effort to get that rise out of you.
Now, I think you're going to like this because it really is right in line with what you were talking about earlier in critical thinking. Before Liz and Sarah, in fact, you can kind of make your way up here if you want to come up and raffle the books. I do want to tell everyone that Indivisible Huron Valley has made a donation in honor of this evening and our guest, Barbara, the News Literacy Project. It's a nonpartisan education nonprofit founded in 2008 that is building a national movement to create systemic change in American education to ensure all students are skilled in news literacy before they graduate high school, giving them the knowledge and the ability to participate in and civic society as well-informed critical thinkers. I hope your book is on your reading list. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for being here tonight. We so appreciate it. Dawn, thank you. And what we're going to do is give you some opportunity to do some autographs over at this table. So if you have your books, you can make a nice line there. And but before we go, we have some books to give away. But one more time, an applause for Barbara McQuade.